My name is Anya Sharma. For as long as I can remember, my world has been measured in stitches and seams, in the whisper of silk and the sturdy comfort of cotton. My life began in a small, second-floor apartment in Port Blossom, Oregon, a city that always smells of damp earth and pine needles. It was just my mother, Lena, and me. My father was a phantom, a story she never told and I never learned to ask about. She once said, with a quiet finality that closed the subject forever, "Some people are just passing through, little bird. They aren't meant to build a nest." So, we built our own. Our nest was modest, filled with secondhand furniture we'd lovingly repainted and mismatched mugs that held our morning tea. Mom worked as a librarian's aide at the city college, her days spent in the hushed reverence of books. She moved with a gentle slowness, a consequence of the heart that had been weak since her own childhood. The doctors had warned her against having me, said the strain would be too much. But my mother, in her quiet way, was a rebel. "You were the one thing my heart was strong enough for," she'd tell me, her hand resting over her chest as if to calm a fluttering bird. Because of her delicate health, I grew up quickly. I learned to read the subtle signs of her fatigue, the slight tremor in her hands, the bluish tint to her lips, and knew when to insist she sit down while I finished making dinner. It was never a chore, it was a rhythm, a silent dance of care we had perfected over the years. It was her hands that first taught my hands to create. She had an old Bernina sewing machine, a relic from her mother, that hummed with a steady, comforting rhythm. When I was 8, she sat me on her lap, my small fingers guiding a scrap of floral fabric under the needle. "The secret, Anya," she whispered, her breath smelling of chamomile tea, "is not to force it. You just guide it where it's meant to go." That lesson stayed with me. While other girls played sports or joined clubs, I found my sanctuary at that machine. Fabric was my language, the way I made sense of the world. I didn't have the grades or the funds for a prestigious design school, so after high school, I enrolled in a technical program for professional dressmaking. Some saw it as a quaint, old-fashioned trade, a step down from a university degree. But to me, it was artistry. I loved the geometry of a perfectly cut pattern, the magic of transforming a flat piece of cloth into something that could hold a memory, a celebration, a dream. We were never wealthy. Our budget was a tightrope we walked with practiced skill. Birthdays were celebrated with homemade cake and a single, thoughtfully chosen gift. Christmases were rich with the scent of cinnamon and the sparkle of hand-strung popcorn on a tiny tree. There were nights I'd hear her weeping softly in her room, the sound muffled by her pillow. I knew she worried about the future, about the precariousness of our life, held together by her fragile heart and my budding dreams. I would lie in my own bed, promising the silent darkness that one day I would build us a world so secure, so beautiful, that she would never have to cry again. That promise was the fuel for my long hours, my sacrificed weekends, my relentless focus. I took a job at a high-end alteration shop downtown, meticulously hemming trousers and reshaping bridal gowns for women whose lives seemed to exist in a different universe. And in that universe, I met Marcus Thorne. He felt like the answer to a question I hadn't even dared to ask, a door opening into a world I had only ever glimpsed through the shop window. He made me feel as though my quiet, hard-working life was not just valid, but admirable. And that, more than anything, was why I let myself fall. I didn't know then that some doors are only meant to be looked through, not walked through. She was waiting for me, my mother, completely unaware that the daughter she had raised to be so careful was about to have her heart carelessly broken. I remember the day I met Marcus Thorne with the kind of crystalline clarity that usually accompanies life-altering moments. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I was at the Gilded Needle, the alteration shop where I worked, wrestling with the intricate lace bodice of a wedding gown. The bride wanted the neckline reshaped, a delicate and nerve-wracking task. My head was bent in concentration, my world narrowed to the needle in my hand and the shimmer of Belgian lace. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption. A man stood there, tall and effortlessly polished in a way that spoke of old money and new ambition. He had dark, thoughtful eyes and a smile that seemed to form slowly, as if taking its time to be genuine. "I was told this is where miracles happen," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. He held up a cashmere coat, a deep charcoal gray, with a tear near the pocket. A casualty of a run-in with a rogue bicycle messenger. I took the coat from him, the fabric impossibly soft under my fingertips. I ran my thumb over the gash. It was a clean tear, but in a difficult spot. "It's not a miracle," I said, my professional focus taking over. "It's just patience and a very fine needle. I can reweave it. You won't even see the mend." He seemed more interested in my process than in the coat itself. He leaned against the counter, watching as I examined the fibers. "You say that so simply. My grandmother used to say sewing was a kind of magic." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," I replied with a small smile, finally meeting his eyes directly. "She was," he said, his own smile widening. "I'm Marcus, by the way. Anya." He left the coat, but he came back a day before it was due, ostensibly to check on its progress. We talked for nearly an hour that day, leaning against the cutting tables amidst the spools of thread and bolts of fabric. He was a junior partner at his father's property development firm, Thorn Development, but he spoke of it with a kind of detached ambition, as if it were a game he was skilled at but not passionate about. What he seemed passionate about was art, architecture, and, for some reason, the way I talked about my work. "You don't just see a dress, do you?" he'd said, watching me sketch an idea for a client. "You see the woman wearing it. You see her story." I felt seen in a way I never had before. He wasn't just handsome or wealthy, he was attentive. He learned my favorite coffee order, remembered a passing comment I'd made about a book I wanted to read, and showed up with it a week later. He treated my modest life not as a curiosity, but as something authentic and admirable. He'd call my work an art form and praise my discipline, a stark contrast to the polite condescension I sometimes felt from the shop's wealthier clientele. For months, our world was a bubble of our own making. We explored the hidden corners of Port Blossom, from tiny, hole-in-the-wall noodle shops to windy bluffs overlooking the Pacific. He'd listen for hours as I spoke of my dream to one day open my own small atelier, a place where I could create custom gowns from scratch. He never made me feel like my dreams were small. And yet, there were shadows at the edges of our bright little world, details I chose to ignore. He spoke of his family, his parents, Isabel and William, in vague, glowing terms, but he never introduced me. Holiday weekends and family birthdays came and went with polite excuses. "Dad's board is in town," or "Mom's charity fundraiser is a members-only thing. It's dreadfully boring, you'd hate it." I accepted these explanations because I wanted to. I wanted to believe that our world was enough. I told my mother about him, of course. She listened with her usual quiet attentiveness, her gaze soft. "He sounds lovely, Anya," she'd said one evening as I recounted a date. "Just remember who you are. Don't let anyone else's world make you feel small in your own." Her words were a gentle warning, but I was too caught up in the glow of being loved to heed them. Marcus didn't make me feel small, he made me feel bigger. When he'd come by the shop late at night and find me still working, he'd kiss my forehead and whisper, "You're the most incredible person I know." I clung to those words. So when he finally said, "It's time you met my parents," my heart soared. This was it. The validation. The moment our separate worlds would finally merge. "They're having a small dinner party on Saturday," he'd said, squeezing my hand. "It's time they meet the woman I love. The woman I love." The words echoed in my head for days, drowning out the faint, persistent whisper of my mother's caution. I spent a week designing and sewing the perfect dress for the occasion, a simple, elegant sheath of deep teal silk that I hoped screamed understated confidence. I was not just Anya Sharma, the seamstress. I was Anya Sharma, the woman Marcus Thorne loved. And I thought, with a painful naivete, that that would be enough. The Saturday of the dinner arrived under a sky the color of a bruised plum. A steady, cold rain had begun in the morning and showed no signs of stopping. Marcus was tied up in meetings all day, so I was to make my own way to his parents' estate on the city's affluent west side. I couldn't justify a cab fare that high, so I wrapped my new dress in a protective garment bag and took the bus, my practical heels clicking on the wet linoleum floor. The bus was warm and steamy, the windows fogged with the breath of its few passengers. At a stop downtown, an elderly woman climbed aboard, her movements slow and frail. She wore a simple cloth coat and a hand-knitted cap, and she clutched a worn canvas tote bag to her chest as if it contained all her worldly possessions. She fumbled in her purse for a moment before her face fell, her voice a reedy whisper as she spoke to the driver. "Oh dear. I seem to have left my wallet at home. I just need to get to St. Jude's, my son." The driver, a man with a tired, impassive face, shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. Policy is policy. No fare, no ride." A few people glanced over and then quickly looked away, caught in that familiar city dweller's dance of feigned ignorance. But I couldn't look away. I saw in her trembling hands and her panicked eyes a vulnerability that felt deeply familiar. It was the same quiet desperation I sometimes saw in my own mother when a bill was larger than expected. Without a second thought, I stood up and walked to the front of the bus. I tapped my transit card on the reader twice. "For me and for her," I said quietly to the driver. The woman turned, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. "Oh no, dear, you mustn't. It's already done," I said with a warm smile. "Please sit down. You're going to St. Jude's." She nodded, clutching my arm for a moment as she steadied herself. "My son, Luca. He had a fall at work. They say he's stable, but a mother needs to see for herself." Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you. Truly." "Of course," I said, returning to my seat. She sat in the seat across the aisle from me. After a few moments of silent, rattling travel, she spoke again. "I'm Eleonora," she said, her voice stronger now. "Eleonora Rossi." "Anya Sharma," I replied. She gave me a long, appraising look, and a gentle smile touched her lips. "Anya, you have a kind heart. Don't ever let the world harden it." We rode the rest of the way in a comfortable silence. When she got off at the hospital stop, she turned and gave me a small wave through the rain-streaked window. "I won't forget this, dear," she called out, her voice nearly lost to the hiss of the bus's air brakes. I smiled back, thinking it was a sweet, fleeting encounter, a small moment of connection in a vast, anonymous city. I had no way of knowing that simple $2 fare would eventually be repaid 100,000 times over. By the time I reached the stop for the Thorne estate, the rain was coming down in earnest. I huddled under the flimsy shelter, changed into my good shoes, and walked the final quarter-mile up a long, winding driveway flanked by perfectly manicured hedges. The house wasn't a house, it was a statement. A sprawling modernist structure of glass, steel, and dark wood, it seemed to float above the manicured grounds, its large windows glowing with a cold, intimidating light. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my silk dress, and rang the bell, the memory of Eleonora's warm gratitude a small, protective ember in my chest. I thought the most difficult part of the evening would be navigating the social niceties. I didn't realize I was walking into an emotional ambush. A housekeeper in a starched gray uniform opened the door, her expression professionally blank. She led me through a foyer that felt more like a modern art gallery than an entryway, all white walls, polished concrete floors, and a single, dramatic sculpture that looked like a tangle of chrome. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lilies and money. Marcus met me at the edge of the living area, a vast, sunken room with a wall of glass overlooking the churning, rain-swept Pacific. He kissed my cheek, a quick, almost perfunctory gesture. "You made it. You look beautiful." But there was a flicker of anxiety in his eyes I'd never seen before. He led me towards his parents, who were standing by the fireplace, holding glasses of white wine. His father, William Thorne, was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a handshake that was firm but offered no warmth. His eyes swept over me, a swift, practiced assessment. "Miss Sharma," he said, his tone polite but dismissive. His mother, Isabel, was perfectly composed in a cream-colored cashmere tunic and tailored trousers. She was beautiful, with sharp, intelligent features, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes, a cool, pale blue, took in every detail of my appearance, from my homemade dress to my simple pearl earrings. "Anya," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Marcus has told us so much about you." The slight pause before the end of the sentence made it sound like an accusation. I smiled, my hands clasped tightly around my small clutch. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. Your home is stunning." "Thank you," Isabel replied, turning back to the fire. "We hired an architect from Zurich. One must invest in quality, don't you find?" The question hung in the air, clearly not meant for me to answer. At dinner, the interrogation began, cloaked in the guise of polite conversation. The dining table was a slab of dark, polished wood that could have seated 20. The four of us sat at one end, the distance between us feeling vast. "So, Anya," Isabel began, delicately spearing a single asparagus tip with her fork. "Marcus tells us you're a seamstress." The word hung in the air, stripped of the artistry I associated with it. It sounded quaint, diminutive. "I'm a dressmaker, yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I specialize in custom bridal and formal wear." "How charming," she murmured. "A vocational skill. So few people have those anymore." "Did you attend the technical college downtown?" "I did," I replied. "It was a very hands-on, practical program." "Of course," William chimed in, swirling the wine in his glass. "Not everyone is cut out for a traditional 4-year university education. Business, law, finance, they require a certain academic rigor." I felt my cheeks flush. I wanted to defend myself, to talk about the complex geometry of pattern making, the deep knowledge of history and materials my craft required. But the words caught in my throat. I glanced at Marcus, hoping for a lifeline, a word of support, a loving look that would tell his parents, "She is brilliant, and that's why I love her." But Marcus was staring intently at his plate, carefully cutting his filet mignon into precise, even squares. He was silent. His silence was a physical presence at the table, a fifth guest who was siding with his parents. The questions continued, each one a small, sharp jab. "And your family, dear?" Isabel asked. "Are they from Port Blossom?" "Just my mother and me," I said. "She's a librarian's aide at the college." A single, loaded syllable. "And you live with her?" "How practical." Every answer I gave seemed to dig my grave a little deeper. I didn't own property. I didn't have a portfolio of investments. My only asset was a skill they clearly considered a hobby. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, the beautiful teal dress that had felt like armor now feeling like a costume I was unworthy of wearing. The final blow came when Isabel turned to Marcus, completely ignoring my presence. "Marcus, darling, have you given any more thought to the summer internship in our London office? It would be a marvelous opportunity for you to network. You need to be thinking about your future, surrounding yourself with the right kind of people." The implication was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. I was not the right kind of people. I couldn't take another moment. I placed my napkin on the table, my hands trembling slightly. "Thank you so much for dinner," I said, my voice surprisingly clear. "But I'm feeling a bit unwell. I should get going." Isabel gave a slight, dismissive nod. "Of course. So lovely to have met you." I stood, my eyes pleading with Marcus to stand with me, to walk me to the door, to say something, anything. He remained seated, a pained expression on his face, and simply said, "I'll call you tomorrow, Anya." I walked out of that house alone and back into the driving rain. I didn't wait for a bus. I just started walking, the cold drops plastering my hair to my face and soaking through my silk dress. The rain wasn't just water, it was a deluge washing away the beautiful fantasy I had built around Marcus. Each step on the slick pavement was a step away from him and, I hoped, a step back toward myself. The heartbreak was a physical ache in my chest, a cold, heavy stone where all my naive hopes had been. I didn't go straight home. The thought of facing my mother, of letting her see the raw humiliation etched on my face, was unbearable. Her heart was a delicate instrument, and my pain was a discordant note I couldn't let her hear. So I walked until the grand houses of the West Side gave way to the familiar, homier streets of my own neighborhood, finally ducking into a 24-hour diner that smelled of stale coffee and grease. I sat in a booth, shivering, and let the hot, bitter coffee warm my hands. For the next few days, I existed in a fog of hurt. Marcus called, as promised. His voice was laced with a placating, frustratingly calm tone. "My parents are just old-fashioned," he explained. "They're protective. It takes them a while to warm up to people." "They weren't warming up, Marcus," I said, my voice flat. "They were measuring me. And you let them." "What was I supposed to do, Anya? Start a fight at the dinner table?" "You were supposed to be on my side," I whispered. The conversation went in circles, ending with his weary sigh and a promise to make it up to me. But the spell was broken. His charm now seemed like a tool, his easy confidence a shield for a fundamental weakness. I didn't answer his calls after that. I threw myself into my work, the hum of the sewing machine a steady counterpoint to the turmoil in my heart. But a different storm was gathering, one far more menacing than a broken heart. It started subtly. Mom seemed more tired than usual, her breathing more labored after climbing the single flight of stairs to our apartment. She waved off my concerns with her usual gentle stoicism. "Just a bit run down, little bird. This damp weather gets into my bones." But one morning, I found her clutching the kitchen counter, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The terror that shot through me was cold and sharp. I called an ambulance, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. At St. Jude's, the same hospital Eleonora had been rushing to, we were ushered into the cardiac unit. After a battery of tests, we sat in a small, sterile office across from a kind-faced cardiologist named Dr. Lena Petrova. Her expression was grave. "Lena," she began softly, "the medication isn't managing your condition anymore. The valve has deteriorated significantly. We need to operate." My own heart felt like it had stopped. "Operate? How soon?" "As soon as possible," Dr. Petrova said, her eyes meeting mine. "Within the next month. We can't wait longer." She paused, and I knew what was coming next. "The procedure is complex. Given that your insurance from the college library is minimal, the out-of-pocket cost will be substantial." "How substantial?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. I looked down at the number. $150,000. The figure seemed to float off the page, unreal and insurmountable. It might as well have been $1 million. It was a sum so far beyond my reality that I couldn't even process it. "There are hospital assistance programs," Dr. Petrova continued gently. "Payment plans, applications for charitable aid. We'll give you all the paperwork." For the next week, that paperwork became my life. I filled out endless forms, wrote pleading letters, and spent hours on the phone with foundations and charities. The responses were a chorus of polite regret. "Your income is just slightly too high to qualify for our lowest tier aid. We have a year-long waiting list for cardiac grants. I'm so sorry, but our funds are currently allocated." Each rejection was another door slamming shut, the echo reverberating in the quiet, terrified space in my chest. My savings, so painstakingly gathered, amounted to just over $7,000, enough for a security deposit on a new life, but not enough to save the one that mattered most. Desperation began to gnaw at me, a cold, relentless hunger. Finally, after another sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, I did the one thing I had sworn I would never do. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's number. My pride had been shattered, my heart broken, but none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was my mother's life. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. "Anya? I didn't waste time on pleasantries." The words tumbled out, shaky and raw. "Marcus, I'm sorry to call you, but I'm in trouble. My mom, she needs emergency heart surgery. It costs $150,000, and I don't have it. The charities won't help. I don't know what else to do." I took a ragged breath. "I'm asking for a loan. I swear I'll pay you back every single penny, even if it takes me the rest of my life." There was a long, chilling silence on the other end of the line. Then he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a short, incredulous huff of air. "Wow," he said, his voice dripping with a cynicism I'd never heard from him before. "You really don't waste any time, do you? My mother called it. She said you were an operator. She said the minute things went south, you'd come looking for a payout. The cruelty of his words struck me like a physical blow. What? No, Marcus, this isn't for me. This is for my mother's life. Right. The sick mother. It's a classic story, Anya, he said, his voice cold and distant. Look, I'm sorry she's ill, I really am. But my family's money isn't a community fund for your problems. I can't help you. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and silent. Marcus, please. Don't call me again, he said, and the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the silence roaring in my ears. He hadn't just said no. He had twisted my desperation into something ugly and transactional. He had taken my deepest fear and used it to justify his family's prejudice. In that moment, the last vestiges of my love for him curdled into a profound and desolate emptiness. I was completely, terrifyingly alone. 2 days later, I was sitting on a bench in the sterile, manicured courtyard of St. Jude's, feeling the last of my hope drain away. Mom was inside for more preoperative tests for a surgery we couldn't afford. I was supposed to be filling out another grant application, but the pen felt heavy in my hand, the questions on the form mocking my powerlessness. I buried my face in my hands, the rough fabric of my jeans absorbing my silent tears. Anya? Dear, is that you? The voice was soft, hesitant, but familiar. I looked up, my vision blurry. Standing before me was Eleonora Rossi, the woman from the bus. She was holding a small bouquet of daisies, and her face was etched with concern. Mrs. Rossi, I managed, quickly wiping my eyes. She sat down beside me, placing a gentle, wrinkled hand on my arm. I thought it was you. My son is in physical therapy here. What's wrong, child? You look like the world is on your shoulders. The dam of my composure broke. The story poured out of me, my mom's diagnosis, the impossible cost, the endless rejections, even the cruel dismissal from Marcus, though I left out his name. I spoke in a low, choked whisper, the shame and fear of it all laid bare in the quiet courtyard. Eleonora listened without interrupting, her expression a mixture of sympathy and a kind of fierce indignation. When I finished, she patted my hand firmly. That young man is a fool with a hollow chest where his heart should be, she said, her voice steely. But that's not your problem anymore. Your problem is your mother. And we're going to solve it. We? I asked, confused. Yes, we, she said, and then she turned and waved. Matteo, over here for a moment. A young man who had been waiting patiently by the doors walked towards us. He was tall, with the same kind eyes as his grandmother, and a quiet, steady presence. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but he carried himself with an unassuming confidence. Matteo, this is Anya Sharma, Eleonora said, her voice full of warmth. She's the angel I told you about. The one who paid my bus fare when I was on my way to see you. She then turned to me. This is my grandson, Matteo. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that held none of Marcus's polished artifice. It's good to finally meet you. My grandmother has been singing your praises. He looked from my tear-stained face to his grandmother's determined one. What's going on? Eleonora explained the situation in her direct, no-nonsense way. As she spoke, Matteo's expression shifted from polite curiosity to deep, focused concern. He listened to the entire story, his gaze fixed on me. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a profound and unsettling empathy. When Eleonora finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he looked directly at me. How much is the surgery? I flinched. Oh no, I wasn't. I can't. Anya, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You helped my grandmother when she was in need, with no expectation of anything in return. You showed her a kindness that she says she'll never forget. Now, it's our turn. How much? My voice was barely audible. $150,000. He didn't even blink. He simply nodded, as if I'd asked for bus fare. Okay. He pulled out his phone. I started a small software company a few years ago. It's done well. More than well, actually. This is not a problem. I stared at him, my mind struggling to comprehend. But you don't even know me. I can't let you do that. You're wrong, he said, his gaze unwavering. I do know you. I know you're the kind of person who helps a stranger on a bus. I know you're the kind of person who is trying to move heaven and earth to save her mother. My grandmother believes kindness should be paid forward. So do I. This isn't charity, Anya. It's an investment. An investment in a good person. Eleonora squeezed my hand. He's right, dear. You gave me the chance to see my boy. Let us give you the chance to keep your mother. I looked between the two of them, the elderly woman with the fierce loyalty and the young man with the quiet, staggering generosity. Tears welled in my eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of disbelief, of overwhelming, world-tilting gratitude. I don't know what to say, I whispered. You don't have to say anything, Matteo said. He was already dialing a number on his phone. Just give me the name of the person in the hospital's billing department. We'll get this sorted out today. He paused and then smiled again. And once your mom is better, you have to let me take you and my grandmother out for the best dinner in Port Blossom. My treat. As I gave him the information, a dizzying sense of hope, so potent it felt like sunlight, flooded through me. It wasn't just about the money. It was the sudden, shocking realization that I wasn't alone. My world hadn't ended with a cruel phone call. A new one was just beginning, built on a foundation of a kindness so pure and unexpected it felt like a miracle. And it had all started with a simple act, a $2 gesture on a rainy afternoon. The days that followed felt like a dream. Matteo was as good as his word. Within 24 hours, the financial manager from St. Jude's called me, her voice filled with a professional awe. Ms. Sharma, a benefactor has covered the full estimated cost of your mother's surgery and post-operative care. Everything is cleared. We're scheduling her for this coming Tuesday. I sank into a chair, the phone pressed to my ear, and simply sobbed with relief. The morning of the surgery, I sat by my mother's bed, holding her hand. It was the first time in weeks I'd seen her look truly peaceful. The lines of worry had smoothed from her forehead. You have good people around you, Anya, she whispered, her gaze drifting towards the door where Matteo and Eleonora had just been, dropping off a flask of coffee and a bag of pastries. That's the greatest wealth there is. The 6 hours she was in the operating room were the longest of my life, but I wasn't alone. Matteo and Eleonora sat with me in the waiting room, a quiet, steadfast presence. They didn't offer platitudes. They talked about books, about Matteo's disastrous attempts at gardening, about Eleonora's prize-winning rose bushes. They wove a blanket of normalcy around my fear, and it was the greatest comfort imaginable. When the surgeon finally appeared, her face tired but smiling, and said the words, "The procedure was a complete success," the relief that washed over me was so immense it left me breathless. My mother's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, she grew a little stronger, her color returning, the light coming back into her eyes. Matteo and Eleonora became regular visitors, no longer benefactors but family. They brought soup, read books aloud to Mom, and argued playfully over crossword puzzles. They filled our small world with a warmth and laughter it hadn't known in a very long time. During one of his visits, while Mom was napping, Matteo sat with me at our small kitchen table. He noticed my sketchbook lying open, filled with designs for wedding gowns. "You're incredibly talented," he said, tracing the lines of a design with his finger. "You ever think about doing this for yourself? Not for someone else's shop?" I gave a small, weary laugh. "It's the dream. But it's always felt a million miles away." "Maybe it's closer than you think," he said, his expression serious. "I told you I see this as an investment. Investing in your mother's health was the first part. Investing in your future is the second. When you're ready, I want to help you start your own atelier. A small business loan. No strings, just a belief in you." This time, I didn't protest. The past few months had taught me a powerful lesson about accepting help, about understanding that my worth wasn't tied to my ability to do everything alone. I had spent so long trying to be strong enough for two people that I had forgotten it was okay to let someone else be strong for me. 9 months later, after Mom was fully recovered and cheering me on from the sidelines, Sharma Atelier opened its doors. It was a small, light-filled space on a quiet side street downtown, with pale wood floors and walls lined with my sketches. Mateo had helped me draw up a business plan, secure the lease, and navigate the labyrinth of permits. Eleonora had insisted on being my first customer, commissioning a silk jacket for special occasions. On opening day, the little shop was filled with friends, a few of my first clients, and the quiet, steady presence of my new family. My mother, her face glowing with health and pride, stood beside me, squeezing my hand as I cut a simple satin ribbon stretched across the doorway. As I looked at the faces in the room, my mother, vibrant and alive, Eleonora, beaming like a proud grandmother, Mateo, standing by the window, smiling his quiet, genuine smile, I felt a profound sense of peace. My life had been broken open, but it had healed into something stronger and more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. I thought, for a fleeting moment, of Marcus and his cold, sterile mansion. I felt no anger, only a distant, quiet pity. He had been a catalyst, a painful but necessary pressure that had forced me onto a path I would never have found on my own. He had taught me the difference between the illusion of love and its true, resilient substance. Our relationship, Mateo's and mine, grew slowly, organically, rooted in the fertile ground of mutual respect and shared kindness. There was no rush, only the quiet joy of discovery, of building something solid and real, one day at a time. Late one afternoon, a few weeks after the opening, I was working on a dress, the soft hum of my Bernina filling the quiet shop. The setting sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the front window, illuminating the dancing dust motes. My mother was in the back, happily organizing spools of thread by color. I looked at the beautiful fabric flowing through my hands, at the life I was building, stitch by careful stitch. And I realized, with a clarity that settled deep in my soul, that I hadn't just been saved. I had been found.